When times were tough, you wouldn't believe the meals we could scrounge up. These dishes might sound strange now, but back then, they were just Tuesday, and you'd be surprised how many of these actually hit the spot. We didn't always call it hobo stew at home. Sometimes it was everything soup or even seafood stew, not because the ingredients came from the sea, but because whatever food you saw, you put in. During the Great Depression, it was the meal of the drifters. The men who rode the rails looking for work, carrying little more than a bedroll and a tin can. They'd gather at camps just outside town, and everyone would toss in what they had. One guy would have a carrot, another an onion, someone else a bit of salt pork or a leftover bone. And before you knew it, there was a stew bubbling in a dented pot over a fire made of scrap wood and newspaper. At our house, it wasn't much different. When payday was still too far off and the pantry looked as dusty as a desert, my mother would pull out the biggest pot we had and start tossing things in. Canned beans, a half-used potato, a limp celery stalk, and some leftover meat from last night's feast. Or, if there was nothing left, just broth made from bouillon cubes and a prayer. Hobo stew didn't have an exact recipe. It looked different every time, sometimes more like a soup, sometimes thick enough to stand your spoon in. But whatever it had, it was always steaming. It filled the kitchen with a smell that made your stomach growl, even if you weren't sure exactly what you were smelling. You might catch a whiff of garlic or cabbage or corn, or maybe just the scent of something hot and homey. One bite might be all tomato and beans. The next might surprise you with a bit of sausage someone forgot we had in the icebox. It was a poor man's dish through and through, not just because it was cheap, but because it was born out of making the best of very little. With hobo stew, it wasn't about what went into the pot. It was what didn't go to waste. A wrinkled pepper, a leftover heel of bread used to sop up the last of the broth. Nothing got thrown away. And when you caught the bottom of the pot where the stew had thickened and browned just a little too much, well, that was the best bite of all. Now, if hobo stew was the meal of the wandering man, then Hoover stew was the meal of the folks trying to ride out the hard times right at home. Once the Great Depression had really sunk its claws into the country, you started hearing President Hoover's name used for all kinds of sorry situations. Hoovervilles, Hoover blankets, which were just newspapers, and Hoover stew, which wasn't exactly stew in the traditional sense, but more a mashup of whatever the government handed out and what you had rattling around in your pantry. The base of it was always macaroni, plain elbow noodles, boiled soft. That was the one thing we always seemed to have. Then you'd add in chopped hot dogs. More often than not, it was those pale, watery ones that came in a pack of 8 for next to nothing. After that, it was whatever canned vegetables you had. You'd heat it all together in one pot, sprinkle some salt and pepper, and serve it hot. At first glance, it didn't look like much. It looked a bit too soupy to be filling. The tomatoes would tint the pasta pinkish orange, and the hot dogs would float around like tiny canoes. But it fed a full table on pennies, and when you were dirt poor, that was enough. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring down into that bowl while I fished around for the biggest piece of hot dog I could find. It had a mild taste to it, slightly salty from the hot dogs, a bit tangy from the tomatoes, soft from the overcooked noodles. You didn't eat it because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there. It was a poor man's dish, no two ways about it. Everything came from a can or a box. There wasn't a fresh thing in sight unless your neighbor had a garden and tossed you a zucchini out of kindness. But at least Hoover stew had heart, and if you ever had to eat it for a week straight, you had to get creative. A splash of ketchup or a slice of American cheese melted on top if your fridge hadn't gone empty yet. But even with all the improvising, it was a dish that reminded you things were tight, but you were still managing. Potato cakes were one of those meals that came together when you didn't have much of anything left, but still had mouths to feed and pride to keep. You'd start with leftover mashed potatoes from the night before, and you'd mix in whatever you had: a cracked egg, a spoonful of flour, some chopped onion, or a shred of dried up cheese if the stars aligned. Sometimes the mashed potatoes were lumpy because we didn't have the energy to beat them smooth the first time. And my mom would just fold the lumps right in. And when we were really scraping, she'd use old potatoes. Soft spots, greenish skins, even a sprout or two. She'd just cut the bad parts out with that short paring knife she used for everything. Waste not, want not. Once formed, she'd fry them up in whatever fat we had. Bacon grease was best for giving them that smoky, salty punch. But just plain lard would do. Mostly, it just tasted hot, but it sure was filling. Served with a spoonful of ketchup or a dab of mustard, you didn't need much else. Potato cakes made their way from Ireland into American kitchens during the lean years, when families didn't throw anything away, especially not potatoes. Potatoes were cheap, plentiful, and filling. A working man's food, or in this case, an out-of-work man's food. If there was ever a meal that summed up hard times in just a few bites, it was the lard sandwich. Yeah, you heard that right. Lard and bread, that's it. Sometimes we didn't even have enough to call it a meal, but we called it lunch all the same. You'd take 2 slices of white bread, the cheap kind that balled up in your fist if you pressed too hard, and you'd smear a good spoonful of lard right in the middle. Lard was cheap and it lasted forever. We'd keep it in an old coffee tin on the counter or a chipped jar in the icebox. If the lard was cold, you'd chip it out of the tin like ice cream. If it had been sitting near the stove, it'd be soft and spreadable, almost like mayo. Sometimes Mama would sprinkle a bit of salt on top, or sugar, depending on what we had and whether we needed sweet or savory that day. There were times I'd come home from school, open the icebox, and there'd be nothing but that dented tin of lard. So out came the bread. If it was stale, you'd toast it right on the stovetop. The whole thing was nothing more than a white smear on a white slice, folded over and eaten like a poor man's taco. I'll tell you what, though, it filled you enough so that you don't sleep with a growling stomach. But don't expect to get much taste out of it. It was greasy, smooth, and bland. Now, this one here is awful. I mean awful. That's the stuff most folks today wouldn't even look at twice, let alone put on a plate. Liver, gizzards, hearts, tripe, kidneys, brains. Whatever part of the animal the butcher didn't sell up, front ended up in a poor man's pan. Everything but the oink, as we used to say. In our house, liver was the most common. My mother would fry it up with onions until the whole kitchen smelled like iron and smoke. Sometimes she'd soak it in milk first to take the edge off. That was her little trick. Said it made the liver taste less livery. Though to this day, I don't think anything could hide that taste completely. It was strong, metallic, kind of bitter. Then there were chicken gizzards. Tough little things unless you knew how to cook them right. Boil them low and slow until they were tender enough to chew. Then dredge them in flour and fry them up crispy. They made a good snack if you had a bowl of ketchup or mustard on the side. And if you got one of those gristly ones, you just chewed a little longer and didn't complain. Brains and eggs was another dish I remember, especially during wartime rationing. Pork brains scrambled with eggs. Soft, creamy, with a texture kind of like custard if you cooked it slow. It wasn't for the faint of heart, but it filled your belly, and the eggs helped stretch it further when meat was scarce. The rich folks didn't want anything to do with offal. They turned their noses up at hearts and kidneys, and that made it affordable for families like mine. At the butcher, Mama would ask for soup bones and scraps, and that often meant she'd come home with a paper bundle full of odds and ends that she'd turn into a stew or fry into something edible. I remember the smell most of all. offal had a way of letting the whole block know what was for dinner. Sharp, earthy, sometimes downright sour if the butcher had sold you something that was almost past its time. One thing only someone who grew up with offal would remember is that weird little green pouch inside a chicken, the gallbladder. You had to be real careful not to nick it when you were gutting the bird, or it'd spoil the meat with this awful bitterness that wouldn't go away no matter how much you cooked it. Oh boy, I need something sweet to wash that last one down. These sugar cookies are a treat, but don't forget, they were still a poor man's dessert in more homes than you'd think. See, back then, we didn't have shelves lined with baking chips and pre-made dough like you do now. If you wanted a sweet, you made it from scratch. And sugar cookies, simple as they were, fit the bill. You only needed a few ingredients: flour, sugar, fat, and an egg if the chickens were laying. No fancy extracts or frosting, not unless it was Christmas and someone had squirreled away a bottle of vanilla from the war years. Most of the time, our sugar cookies came out of the oven plain and a little rough around the edges. They were thin, crisp, and often a little uneven from being rolled with a drinking glass and cut out with a tin can that had both ends popped off. If Mama was feeling fancy, she'd sprinkle a bit of sugar on top before baking to give it a shimmer and a little crunch when you bit in. They were considered poor man's cookies because the recipe was bare bones. It tasted sweet, sure, but not overly so. A little buttery too, but mostly it just tasted like warmth. It was a cookie you dunked in your coffee or ate slowly while the radio crackled with the news. I still remember how we'd line them up on a dish towel to cool, because we didn't have those fancy cooling racks. There was always one that burned on the edge because the stove ran hot on one side. That was the one you gave to the dog. Cabbage and potatoes was the backbone of a poor man's supper, plain as a cotton dish towel and just as reliable. You could feed a whole family on this dish for a couple dimes, and better yet, it kept. That's why it showed up on tables from the tenements in Chicago to farmhouses out in Oklahoma. Both cabbage and potatoes lasted for weeks in a cool pantry or cellar. Even if they got a little soft or sprouted some eyes, Mama just grabbed a paring knife and dug out the bad bits. And if the outer leaves of the cabbage were wilted or slimy, she just peeled them off till she hit the good stuff. To make it, you chop the potatoes and cube the cabbage right alongside. Everything went into the same pot. The smell of boiling cabbage wasn't exactly something you'd bottle and sell, but it meant food was coming, and that was all that mattered. It looked humble too. Pale green cabbage wilting down into soft ribbons. The potatoes breaking apart just a little, turning everything starchy and thick. It was mild and earthy. The potatoes gave it body. The cabbage gave it a touch of sweetness when it cooked down right. If you were lucky enough to have an onion or a clove of garlic to throw in the pot, it took on a whole new depth. A splash of vinegar, maybe a shake of pepper, and you had yourself a full-on meal, not a pretty one, but one that stuck to your ribs. This dish had roots all over: Irish, Polish, German, immigrant food, Depression food, Dust Bowl food. It was a universal dish that showed up whenever a dollar had to stretch across a whole week. You could serve it 3 nights in a row, mash it one day, fry it the next, and no one complained. In fact, the second day always tasted better. Let it sit in the ice box overnight. Reheat it in a cast iron skillet till the edges got a little crispy, and that was the good stuff. Here's one that'll make the fancy folks wrinkle their noses: ketchup spaghetti. But when the cupboard was down to odds and ends, this was a godsend in a pot. This dish didn't come from Italy. It came from desperation. It made regular appearances back in the 50s and 60s in homes where paycheck to paycheck was normal. You couldn't afford pasta sauce, and you sure as heck weren't simmering fresh tomatoes on the stove for 4 hours. But ketchup. There was always a bottle of that somewhere in the fridge. Ketchup spaghetti was exactly what it sounds like. Boiled pasta and ketchup stirred in as your sauce. Sometimes you'd fry it up in a skillet after mixing it, just to crisp the edges and get a little flavor going. And if your pantry blessed you with butter or margarine, you'd melt a pat into the noodles before adding the ketchup. That gave it a silky coat and made it feel a little more like you meant to make it that way. The noodles came out glossy with a reddish-orange color. Not quite spaghetti with tomato sauce, but not plain pasta either. And as you would expect, it tasted like ketchup. But when you were a kid and hungry, it was good enough, especially with a slice of hot dog chopped in. You made it when there was no meat, no vegetables, no time, and no money. Some folks might call it poverty pasta, and I suppose that's fair. But it was also one of those meals that gave a little joy when joy was hard to come by. It felt like you made something, even if all you did was boil water and squeeze a bottle. Bean soup was one of the cheapest meals you could make that still felt like it hugged your insides. A bag of dry beans was dirt cheap and could stretch across a week if you played your cards right. Mama would dump them in a big pot, rinse them off, and then soak them overnight if she remembered. Sometimes she didn't, and they'd just take a little longer on the stove. The base was beans and water. That was it some days. But if you had a ham hock or the bone from Sunday dinner, you'd toss it in for flavor. Heck, even just the rind from a piece of salt pork could turn plain beans into Sunday special. And you seasoned with whatever was around: an onion, a bay leaf, pepper if you weren't out. Salt came late, after the beans softened up. That's how you made sure they didn't turn to rocks while boiling. Looking at it, all you would see is a pale, brothy soup of beige. The beans would plump up, break down a little, and thicken the broth naturally. You could mash a few on the side of the pot with a wooden spoon to make it heartier. You could taste every ingredient, because there weren't many to hide behind. Sometimes Mama served it with cornbread, sometimes with day-old bread, fried in bacon grease and called croutons, even if they were just crunchy and burnt on one side. 1 pound of dry beans could feed a whole family for 2-3 days. 4 if you watered it down and served smaller bowls. And if you were lucky enough to have leftovers, that next day bean soup was thicker, richer. Some folks even added a scoop of cold rice or broken up pasta to stretch it even further. Most folks today toss their watermelon rind straight into the trash, never thinking twice. But back in the day, especially when nothing could go to waste, we used every part of that melon, skin to seed. That rind was the poor man's bonus after a sweet summer treat. On a hot day in July, having a slice of watermelon gave you energy. Once you eat the red centers clean, take the leftover rinds, just the white part between the fruit and the green skin, and turn them into something new. Peel off the tough outer skin, cube the white part, and boil it down with sugar, vinegar, a little clove, and a cinnamon stick. Let it sit and soak a day or two in a jar, and you had sweet and sour, slightly crunchy pickles that would show up on the side of everything from fried pork chops to cold lunch meat sandwiches. Pickled watermelon rind was tart, sweet, with a bit of spice that hit you right in the back of the throat. It had a bite, but not like dill pickles. It was softer, more fragrant, like the South in a jar. The texture was tender with just a little snap, almost like a firm pear but soaked in summer. Watermelon wasn't something we had every day. It was seasonal, special, and usually shared. So turning the rind into pickles meant we got to stretch that pleasure out. Kept in a mason jar in the icebox, those pickled rinds could brighten up a plate of beans or leftover ham weeks after the melon was gone. Sometimes, the pickling syrup would turn a little syrupy and dark after a few weeks, and that's when it tasted the best. Thick, rich, and almost molassesy. You'd sneak a forkful straight from the jar right before supper. and hope Mama didn't hear the clink. Mention squirrel at the supper table these days, and folks'll look at you funny. But back then, that was good, honest meat if you knew how to shoot straight. Squirrel wasn't something you picked up at the store. It was something you earned, usually with a .22 rifle, quiet and steady, out near the edge of the woods just after sunrise. My mom would skin 'em out back, had a trick where she'd cut around the middle and pull the hide off like she was peeling a sock. You knew you had a good one if it was lean, not too tough, and no buckshot in the meat. Squirrel pot pie wasn't pie the way most folks picture it today. This wasn't no golden-crusted, picture-perfect dish from a diner. This was a stew, thick and rich, cooked low and slow with squirrel meat, potatoes, carrots, onions, and little hand-rolled dough strips, kind of like dumplings or thick noodles, floating in a savory gravy. That squirrel tasted somewhere between chicken and rabbit, with a little more gamey kick. The legs were the best part, like tiny drumsticks, and the back had just enough meat to make it worth the picking. The broth had this deep, nutty flavor, especially if the squirrel had been feeding on hickory or walnut trees. We always said the fall squirrels tasted better than the spring ones. When times were tough, you couldn't afford to be squeamish. If you lived rural, especially in the South or Appalachia, squirrel was and still is a worthy addition to the dinner table, same as rabbits, possum, or whatever you could trap. It's meat when meat isn't affordable. Sometimes, though, you'd bite down and hit a little piece of birdshot or .22 casing that didn't get picked out. You'd set it on the edge of your plate without a word. The name alone tells you right away what kind of times it came from. Water pie was born from the same spirit that turned scraps into stew and bones into broth. It used to be that the women were determined to make anything sweet to lift the spirits of a family that had been staring down beans and cornbread all week. So they took what they had: water, sugar, flour, a bit of butter, and a drop or two of vanilla or cinnamon. They would pour water right into a pie crust. Store-bought didn't exist, so it was rolled out by hand, tough as leather some days, and sprinkle flour and sugar across the top. Then came the butter, cut into little dots and floated on top like gold nuggets. It all baked low and slow, and by the end of it, the whole family had a wobbly, sweet, custard-like filling that set up as it cooled. Looked a bit like clear Jell-O crossed with a sugar tart. Some batches were more syrupy, others more gelatinous. It all depended on how thin the flour was. Water pie is sweet, mild, almost buttery, with a slick kind of texture that stuck to your teeth a little. It wasn't rich or deep like a pecan pie or chocolate cake. It was subtle, a whisper of a dessert, if you will. But when your palate was used to bitter coffee, boiled cabbage, and dry toast, that sugary slice of water pie felt downright luxurious. One problem I have with this is that the crust always got a little soggy on the bottom. Never failed. You could bake it longer, raise the rack, whatever trick you tried, it was gonna be damp. But hey, beggars can't be choosers. People of the Midwest down through the Rust Belt know that goulash was the poor man's one-pot miracle. To be clear, this is not the Hungarian kind with paprika and beef chunks. No, sir. This was American. Elbow macaroni, ground beef if you had it, a can of tomatoes, and enough salt and pepper to bring it to life. It looked like a big red mash of noodles and meat, steaming hot from a dented Dutch oven. And it was never made the same way twice. It was built on what was left. Half a box of pasta, toss it in. Last scoop of yesterday's chili, mix it up. We made do. Goulash filled you up fast, especially with a hunk of white bread on the side. The noodles would soak up every last drop of sauce if it sat too long. Next day, it wasn't soupy. It was almost like tomato macaroni casserole. We'd eat it cold from the fridge or slap it in a lunchbox and pray it was still warm by noon. Chicken noodle soup is a dish with two faces. One side says comfort, the other says survival. These days, folks think of it as something cozy, served with a grilled cheese when someone's feeling under the weather. But back in our day, especially during the lean years, it was what you made when you had one skinny chicken and needed to stretch it across a week. See, real chicken noodle soup didn't come from a can. It came from a pot that simmered all day long. You'd start with what you had, a leftover carcass from Sunday's roast, or sometimes just backs and necks from the butcher, the parts no one else wanted. Get the bony bits cheap and boil the flavor right out of them. You boiled it low and slow with water, salt, a bay leaf if you had one, and whatever else was lying around. Celery tops, onion peels, carrot nubs, it all went in. Then came the noodles, usually handmade, just flour, egg, and a bit of water, rolled out and cut with a knife. You dried them on a floured tea towel if you had time, or dropped them fresh into the pot if you didn't. They'd puff up as they cooked, soaking in that broth, turning soft and hearty. If you were really broke, you made more noodle than soup, just to fill bellies. The soup looked simple: golden broth, pale noodles, flecks of herbs or bits of carrot and chicken if you had them. Savory, a little salty, and most importantly, soothing. If you were raised on it, you'll remember. Sometimes it was thin as tea, other times thick enough to eat with a fork. All depended on how far it had to go. Onion sandwiches was a poor man's meal in every sense of the word. But if you liked onions, it hit the spot. Bread was cheap and onions were even cheaper. You could grow them easy in a backyard garden or pick up a sack for next to nothing. They'd last in a root cellar for weeks, even months. So when the meat was gone, the eggs were gone, and the beans were getting rationed out one scoop at a time, you whipped these up. There were two main ways folks did it. Some went plain, just onion on white bread, maybe sprinkle a little salt on top. Sharp, raw, tear-inducing, tasted like it could knock the cold right out of your chest. Others dressed it up a bit, spread a little mayo or lard or even butter. That'd soften the bite some, mellow it out. The taste was strong and pungent. Raw onion doesn't fool around. It stings your nose and bites your tongue. But with that soft bread around it, especially when the bread was fresh and still warm from the bakery, it had a kind of balance. Only thing is, that onion flavor lingered all afternoon. You'd taste it again around supper time. And if you went to school after eating one, well, you better hope your classmates did too, or you weren't going to be too popular. I don't know about you, but I could use a sugar cookie right about now. If this video made you hungry in a weird kind of way, go ahead and give it a like. And if you want more, subscribe to Memory Manor and stick around. Thanks for dropping by.